Welcome to Politi-Talk Centered, where we invite you to have the conversation. I'm your host, Sandman.
And I'm your co-host, Holland.
Thank you for joining us today as we discuss Hong Kong's present and future. All right, so in the previous video, if you haven't seen it, I'll have a link in the description. But we basically kind of covered the timeline that led up to everything that Hong Kong is today. We're now starting off on the present day and the national security law, which is a topic of extreme controversy and an issue that Hong Kong is facing right now. So we'll just dive right into it. So the national security law, in very abridged, covers the following: secession, breaking away from the country; subversion, undermining the power of authority of the central government; terrorism, using violence or intimidation against people; and collusion with foreign or external forces.
And I would like to add into the terrorism section. So they admitted that any obstruction of public transportation is considered terrorism.
Yeah, and we'll get into those provisions too. But yeah, it's kind of stupid. It as we read through this, you're gonna see how just widely umbrellaed this law is, and it's just it's so loose and vague that you could literally apply it to anything and anyone. That it's essentially a very big turn point towards Chinese communist way of life in mainland China. So the new law, there's key provisions for the new law, and they include the following: crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces are punishable by a maximum sentence of life in prison. Damaging public transport facilities can be considered terrorism. And when we say damaging, literally basic vandalism. So if you're spray painting the metro, that is terrorism, according to this law. Those found guilty will not be allowed to stand for public office. Companies can be fined if convicted under the law, which kind of opens up the avenue that China will be able to essentially extort and control free enterprise businesses in Hong Kong. Beijing will establish a new security office in Hong Kong with its own law enforcement personnel, neither of which would come under the local authorities' jurisdiction. And then in the previous video, there was a protest camp that was dismantled. The individual that was in charge of that was Zheng Yanzhong, which I apologize if I'm probably butchering it, but we'll call him Zheng. So Mr. Zheng was the officer or individual that headed those raids on those protest camps a couple years back. He has a very interesting history. He's definitely a career party man. He's very high ranking in the Communist Party.
They referred to him as a hardliner.
Yeah, and he's now going to be the one that's in charge of this new security office in Hong Kong. And we'll kind of get into the fear aspect later, but kind of remember his name when we get to that part, because there's so much more than just his past qualifications that I think they chose him for that position. And he's done many other, he's worked on and headed many other anti-protest and freedom operations throughout mainland China. This office can send cases to be tried in mainland China, but Beijing has said it will only have the power over a tiny number of cases. And for China to say that they only have power over a tiny number of cases is an outright complete lie, because as we read through this, you're going to see that they basically can completely dictate which court anybody goes to. Basically allows China to be like, okay, we're going to try you on communist law, or we're going to let you be tried by your little freedom law over here. So it's just crazy.
Powerhouse their way.
Say what?
They definitely powerhouse their way in.
Oh yeah. In addition to that, Hong Kong will have to establish its own National Security Commission to enforce the laws, with a Beijing-appointed advisor. So not only that, it's adding insult to injury. Not only is China forcing Hong Kong to have a security office with basically staffed by whoever China decides to put in there, they're making Hong Kong put together their own office to enforce these laws. And China still gets to decide kind of who's advising it. It's crazy. Hong Kong's chief executive will have the power to appoint judges to hear national security cases, raising fears about judicial autonomy. And it's interesting because I think the one way Beijing was able to get away with so much of this is that they put a lot of power in the chief executive's hands. And like, you know, we go back to when Ms. Lam was appointed or sworn in, you know, the Chinese premier went to Hong Kong and was telling her, you know, play nice or else. And, you know, so it's like they're giving her all this power, but, you know, if she uses any of it to try to undo anything, it is pretty much, you know, the end for her. So it's really screwed up.
She was basically given like a false power.
Yeah. It's like you get the cheese, but you know it's on a mousetrap. Importantly, Beijing will have power over how the law should be interpreted, not any Hong Kong judicial or policy body. So if the law conflicts with any Hong Kong law, the Beijing law takes priority, which completely usurps their legislative and judicial system. They might as well not have freedom laws anymore anyway, because every democracy and freedom law in Hong Kong goes against every law in China. Another issue too that's kind of scary is that some trials will be held behind closed doors. People suspected of breaking the law can be wiretapped and put under surveillance. Management of foreign non-governmental organizations and news agencies will be strengthened, and the law also applies to non-permanent residents and people from outside Hong Kong who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong. Literally anyone in the world, and we'll get into that more in a second. This also mandates that anyone entering public office in Hong Kong must take oath swearing allegiance to Beijing. So, and one thing that I noticed that went into this security law, every protest, like every issue that was protested in the past, and every issue that Hong Kong has not been or that Beijing has not been able to impose on Hong Kong in the past, they're throwing into this. They're making this kind of like a one-all catch-all thing for everything that they've ever wanted to do to Hong Kong, that they, because of how because of the democracy and the freedom of Hong Kong, they were not completely able to. So this is how they are able to get around it, by putting it onto the security law. So the huge overreach. According to Article 38 of the law, it applies to offenses committed outside the region by a person who is not a permanent resident of the region. An example, a foreign journalist writes an editorial that proposes sanctions against China could fall under the provision of the law inciting hatred against Beijing. Donald Clark, who's a professor at the George Washington University, stated, "It's asserting extraterritorial jurisdiction over every person on the planet." He also noted that the national security law is even more broad in scope than China's own criminal law. And Article 54 of the security law could affect foreign media outlets, non-governmental organizations, and other international groups imposing more stringent regulation and censorship in Hong Kong. So, massive umbrella overreach. Literally, you could post an American can post something on Facebook, and talking bad about the Chinese government treating Hong Kong poorly. And if you ever go to Hong Kong and they happen to find that post, you might not ever be seen again.
Yeah, secret police will come and get you.
Scary and crazy. So outside of the huge overreach that it umbrellas basically every human on Earth, there's also a judicial bypass. So law will allow cases under its provisions to fall under Chinese jurisdiction, or the law will allow it. People can be extradited to mainland China for trial. China can waive trial by jury and deny public access to the trial if the case is deemed to contain sensitive information. So I don't remember the exact year. In the previous video, we mentioned there was one major protest because of extradition laws. And here we see it. They threw it in there. They weren't able to get it then, so they're going to get it now. The Chinese and Hong Kong legal systems are incompatible. So China's must be seen as the default legal authority. And, that's the kind of screwed up part. It's like they're not meant to be compatible. Obviously, communism and capitalism will never be compatible. The whole point of Hong Kong having a special status is it's one country, two systems. Those two systems don't have to perfectly communicate and work together. If anything, they shouldn't. And having the pretense that, this doesn't work, so we're just going to default to, the Chinese law and powers it completely undercuts everything that Hong Kong is supposed to be. And now the intent of the law. Let's kind of play devil's advocate a little bit and try to see if we can justify China doing this. So the law is designed to quell any dissent in Hong Kong against Beijing's rule, because after all, Hong Kong is still a part of China.
I feel like it's like they mentioned before, it's to deter, like the population of Hong Kong. And I can see from many aspects from where like some of the Hong Kong citizens themselves and China, the CCP has also said is that, it's more to kind of get them on the track of falling into place for when that 50 years goes up.
In a way. And yeah, we're getting closer for sure to that date, but it's like it's still like they have an agreement. We're talking about a wartime peace treaty type of agreement between Britain, as well as a separate one that is similar in nature with the United States. Now, this was done at the end of World War II. And these agreements, they're agreements. It's like, hey, you guys treat Hong Kong like this, and we're good. And outside of that, even, there's trade agreements with the U.S. and other countries with Hong Kong that are based on the pretense of Hong Kong remaining autonomy. So it goes far beyond just, we're getting close to this time. I guess we should get them used to communism again. It's like, no, you can't do that because that's not the agreement. We didn't say, 50 years, but, when it's getting closer, you guys can start, conditioning them. It's like, no, it's 50 years, then you can screw them over.
Or we can screw them over. I mean, I can see China's point. It's 25 years in the past almost. Kind of time for them to start taking control of what belongs to them, I guess.
In a way. I guess playing devil's advocate even more, I totally understand why China's doing it. And like the communist mindset and ideology. Absolutely. If this is definitely an excellent step forward for the communist government. But just with agreements alone, it's like you literally broke your promise, both to Hong Kong and the world. Getting back into the intent of the law, Jacques Delis, I can't pronounce these names. I apologize. But Jacques, a professor and expert on Hong Kong's legal system at the University of Pennsylvania, said that the crimes listed in the law, and I quote, are all vaguely defined and thus potentially capacious in practice. So it's like literally, and like, we talked about before how this security law is even more broad-reaching than China's own security laws. So it's like they have made this very specifically with the intent and mindset of screwing over Hong Kong, more so than they already do their own people.
And the way I look at it is, like I said, devil's advocate is, here they, wanted their freedom, their democracy, all this, and China is not about that. China's all like, we're communism.
It's the exact opposite.
Yeah, and I can see where China is going to hardcore throw the book at Hong Kong when when that 50 years is up. Think about it. If they don't do anything now, if they were not to do anything and they were to wait their 50 years, by the end of it, what's going to happen is, it's going to be a massacre of, devastation for Hong Kong because, they're going to be so used to that democracy. They're going to be so used to the way things are that when that change does happen, it's going to be like two little nations going at each other, except for China is bigger, but they would definitely be fighting. So I can see where they're like, hey, we're going to hit you with a book now. We're going to show you, we're going to get you into the way of, communism. When we break you down, this law might be letting up after that. Once we incorporate you into our society.
And we'll kind of get into that too with the future of Hong Kong. But yeah, definitely it's a step towards conditioning. Another aspect that going back, it's things that China tried to do in the past, and now they're just putting it all into one thing. It also the security law also mandates that Hong Kong government undertake national security education in schools, social organizations, and media outlets. Which is similar to a shelved 2012 legislation that would have inserted more patriotic education in the Hong Kong curricula. So if it sounds like propaganda, it's propaganda. And I think out of everything, this is the most important thing for China to have re-education in schools and stuff is probably the most important thing for them as far as conditioning and creating the mindset of the people that is going to be conducive with the communist lifestyle. And I haven't read the security law. I'll post a link in both video descriptions for the security law. It's been translated. But I have a feeling that this section is very short but very precise, because a lot of the rest of it, it's like kind of like past grievances that they wanted righted finally, but I think a lot of it is also smokescreen, because I have a feeling like this is the most important part of that entire law to them. Moving into more of the fear aspect in Hong Kong. So there are reports of people that were deleting their Facebook posts and concerns that candidates opposing the national security law would be disqualified from running elections. So like literally the day that, and nobody knew about this either, that this was happening, but the day this was done, people were deleting posts. Many of the pro-democracy, pro-freedom groups completely disbanded within hours Yeah, within hours of this happening, they disbanded. Now they're still working in secret, but their publicly known stuff, yeah, they shut down.
I mean, I would leave too.
Yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, and honestly, that's a thing that probably many people need to consider is, are they going to stay and fight, or are they going to get out? Because come the next couple of years, they might not have that opportunity anymore. They might not have the freedom to leave the country. Many are also afraid of Hong Kong's judicial independence will be eroded, and its judicial system will look increasingly similar to mainland China's. The city, Hong Kong, is the only common law jurisdiction in all of China. The rest is communist. It's clear that the law will have a severe impact on the freedom of expression, if not personal security, on the people of Hong Kong. Professor Johannes Chan, a legal scholar at the University of Hong Kong, told the BBC, before the passage of the law, effectively, they are imposing the People's Republic of China's criminal system onto the Hong Kong common law system, leaving them with complete discretion to decide who should fall into which system, Professor Chan said. And like we talked about before, Beijing will establish its own security office in Hong Kong, and it's going to be headed by Zhang, who we talked about before. So a little bit on Zhang. So this guy is a known Communist Party man, career man. He has always been seen at the front of or involved with a lot of anti-protesting operations in mainland China, a lot of pro-freedom movements that he's been in charge of getting rid of, as well as working directly with the secret police and known for torturing individuals. So
that's including foreigners.
Yeah. If you want to kind of talk on that story real quick, that journalist guy.
Yeah, so there was a journalist from the UK that was back in Wuhan, who was trying to basically get the story on what was happening. And, his story obviously was not in favor of the CCP. So Zhang was sent out with a few of his security, like the Secret Service police that they call themselves. And he basically got a hold of this guy and tortured him for, I think, a week almost, and then sent him back to the UK after obviously the parliament and stuff, they're going to try and get him out of there when something like that happens. Same thing with America. If one of our journalists were to get captured or something, they're going to at least try and talk to the Chinese government or whoever to try and get you out of there. Like the incident that happened, a little off topic, but like incident happened like a couple years ago with North Korea and the college student who ended up on the plane. Same deal. Your government's going to try and get you back. They did, and I mean, he talked about his experience, and it was a pretty torturous one. It seems like one that I wouldn't ever want to be in, and with this guy coming in and being in charge of this new law, I don't blame Hong Kong's people, because I'm sure his name alone carries a weight to them. And, people want to these protesters are going to quit now, they're going to leave. I mean, when it comes to, being tortured and, having your life completely stripped away from you, can you really blame someone who really wants to fight for something, but at the same time, when the biggest person in that country, who is basically a hardcore lapdog for the CCP, is basically going to sit there in Hong Kong with you and is going to be watching everything, and you don't know if they're going to come get you in the middle of the night, you don't know if they're just going to pick you up off the street. So, they definitely took their opportunity and fled.
Yeah. And like with that too, it's like, I don't think this is going to change the mindset of people. Obviously they're still going to want to fight for their freedom, but it's going to change it from where you were allowed to be out in public, your face out in public, your name in public, and attached to your political views, to more kind of guerrilla protesting where, people wear masks and anonymity, is virtue and whatnot, and just, is going to become much more clandestine. But the people will still, I think the people will still fight for their rights, as they should.
Yeah, like you said, they're not going to be out in the open as much as they were. Before, they used to have their face out in the open, they had their identity out in the open, everybody knew who was top of the leader when it came to fighting for these rights. And, like you said, now they're going to be behind masks, kind of like that little group, the Anonymous and stuff, behind masks, completely anonymous to the world on, who they are.
And you can go on and on about the mentality of fear, even like talking with their leader right now, Miss Lam. Just having the premier going there to talk to her for her chief executive position. That's all fear, and really that's the only way communism works in every country that's ever done it, has been through fear of the general populace. If that fear is not there, the people will not stand for the treatment that they receive in communism. So it's that you cannot have it without fear. So, kind of moving into why did this happen? So, in the previous video, we kind of talked about the security law and what it comes from. So the article, Article 23 has always been an article in the basic law that was established when Hong Kong got its separate system placement. And the people of Hong Kong, the legislator and the chief executives of the time, never established the law. They never enacted it. So basically, it was left open, meaning they didn't have any kind of security, state security law, and that opened the door for China to do it. So that's kind of one aspect to it. If they had done something to just fill in that article so that there was something there, that potentially could have prevented China from being able to intervene in the way they did. So that's one part. So we also talked about how Hong Kong was handed back from Britain under the agreement of one country, two systems principle. The mini constitution, which is their basic law, protects certain freedoms like freedom of assembly, speech, and independent judiciary, and some democratic rights. And these are freedoms that no other part of mainland China has. The same agreement also states that Hong Kong is, and we kind of just talked about that, like they're supposed to have their own national security law. And like I said, the unpopularity of it made it to where they never did, and that's where China stepped in and did it. In 2019, there were protests over an extradition law that turned violent and evolved into a broader movement of anti-China and pro-democracy. And that's important to note too, because when it's just talking about democracy and freedom, that's kind of already there. I think the Chinese government was not patient, but they kind of allowed it to happen. But when it comes to anti-China, all right, that's when the Chinese government's going to have a problem. It's like they basically are looking at them like treason, which with this security law now, that is treason. And Beijing's other, kind of their headliner excuse is that the law is crucial to safeguarding Hong Kong's economic development and political stability. which is ironic. I find that ironic because, yeah, there's been protesting, there's been civil unrest, but it's only after Beijing interferes. If Beijing doesn't do anything, they're fine. Their economic development and political stability is fine. But it's only when they intervene. So it's just an irony that they would say that that's, why the law is crucial. The irony is not lost on me. Now then, can China even do this? We kind of talked about the original treaty agreements and stuff that established the two parties, or two systems, one country formula, and all the agreements for trade and stuff. So, if the agreement states one country, two systems, how is it justified for Beijing to intervene in this way when the people of Hong Kong have those guaranteed freedoms under the handover agreement? And on top of this, and this is, I think, the biggest slap in the face, the chief executive, Carrie Lam, said that she was not allowed to see a draft before the law's passage. So she wasn't even able to see a law directly affecting her country until after it was passed, which I think is incredibly insane. The basic law says Chinese laws can't be applied in Hong Kong unless they are listed in a section called Annex 3. These laws can be introduced by decree, which means they bypass the city's parliament. So using that loophole, and also because it's a law that is supposed to be enacted in their mini constitution to begin with, they were able to legally circumnavigate the Hong Kong government and kind of throw in their own thing. So justified by the letter of the law, yes. Morally and ethically, I'd say no. And then another aspect to this that we need to consider is back in the 90s. In 1993, like we said in the other video, Hong Kong was worth 27% of China's GDP. That is huge. Such a small little area is worth 27% of your country's GDP, and you have like the landmass of almost all of Asia. Like, that's insane. Today, however, it's only worth 2.7% of China's total GDP. So, they are not the powerhouse that they used to be. And that's an issue, because that greatly undermines the leverage that Hong Kong had over Beijing. And that's ironically thanks to China's adoption of more capitalistic policies in its industry in the recent decades. Which I guess works. It's good for them. So I guess we can't complain too much. Now, how does this affect international relations? So for the U.S. on the position of autonomy, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, which it's his job to basically observe and verify if Hong Kong is still autonomous. That's part of his job as the Secretary of State. He announced that the State Department no longer considers Hong Kong to have significant autonomy under Chinese rule, indicating that the Trump administration would likely end some or all of the U.S. government's special trade and economic relations with the territory, jeopardizing its position as a global trade hub. Now, to be clear on this, Trump has publicly kind of acknowledged this in, probably an attempt to kind of put pressure on the Chinese government, but in no way have I found anything on him making any direct statements or motions or signing anything to do that. And part of that, I think, is because it's an election year. And this is an issue that can kind of sit for a minute until after the elections, which I don't blame him. And also the other thing too is you have to take into consideration the United States exports more to Hong Kong than we import. So there is a lot of financial loss to be had with that if we cut off trade agreements with Hong Kong. And coming out of COVID and the economic drop that we experienced because of that, now is not the best time to be cutting avenues of making money for our nation, rather than just kind of fostering them and letting them just stay there for now. So near future, I don't think this changes too much. Long term, the waves get bigger and bigger the further out you go. So Hong Kong's future. The end of the agreement is in 2047. That's when all legal provisions established by the handover treaties will end, and any obligation or responsibility for Beijing to honor them end as well. And basically, mainland China will have every right to mandate communist law on Hong Kong if they choose to do so. And this could create a civil war. In fact, I think it's almost inevitable that if China dissolves their government setup in any way more than they have already, that it will end up in a civil war with Hong Kong and China, and possibly China, fighting for its complete independence, which it'd be crazy. I mean, it'd be literally watching history happen. The other thing with that is, like we've talked about the trade agreements and stuff. When this ends, yes, the treaty will end, and the handover will end, but all of the trade agreements with, I think, almost every country, at least on the Allied side, are dependent on Hong Kong's freedoms and democracy. Their established kind of state that they have. So even though the agreement will end, the trade agreements will still be based on their autonomy. And so, it's going to be a big thing for the United States. Whoever is president in 2047, they're going to have a lot of weight in the future of Hong Kong as far as China's decision is concerned. Because if they decide to cut that since the agreement's over, and just make it open trade with Hong Kong, which at that point they might as well just make open trade with China. The Chinese government can do whatever they want. I think it's very important that the president of that time strengthen and make more stringent the requirements on Hong Kong's autonomy for trade. I think that's going to be the only way Hong Kong is going to have any chance without fighting for themselves to get fair treatment. So yeah, nobody really knows what's going to happen at the end of when 2047 hits. But one thing's for sure, it's going to be turbulent. Because if history has showed us anything, the people of Hong Kong are extremely proud. They're extremely intelligent, and they will fight for what they believe is right. So what are your kind of thoughts on everything?
I think I mentioned before, like, I see both sides. Like, I see, it all plays back, like, basically all the way. If you go back to the talking points that we've already talked about, it goes back all the way from, like, the 1800s all the way till now. This has been an ongoing issue for a few generations. Since, with Hong Kong and China, that is what I mean. It's because, Britain owned them before. So, they kind of had, like, their own democracy at the time from China. And, I feel like they've gotten a taste of that. They've gotten to know what, democracy and what freedom is, and, what it's like to have a say in it. And China has always been, it's, hey, we're part of the CCP. This is how things are going to go. Like, what we say is the truth, and you're going to go by it. And then the thing with that, though, is, let's say they're really just trying to reform them by like, trying to force this new law into action just to kind of maybe Hong Kong really doesn't want that civil war. Maybe they want the fact that like, hey, guess what? Maybe if we implement this law hardcore, and maybe it's not even like a permanent law either. It's one that's once everything is settled by that 2047, they're hoping that Hong Kong and China would be underneath the CCP completely, and the people are just going to follow it at that point, not even batting an eye. And then when that law is lifted up in 2047, they're going to feel a little more freer because, like they said, like you mentioned, their laws are not as strict as this new national security law.
I could see that.
It would kind of give them a sense of, hey, we're a little bit freer now. Like, so then it would kind of add that content, that happiness to it that, hey, we're officially one with China, stuff like that. Like we're on the same level with them.
It's kind of like a blissful lie.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of like 1984 or whatever with the with George Oswell.
Yep.
In a way.
In a way.
So kind of like that. That's how I see it. But like you said, by 2047 too, there could be like with that kind of repression, there's going to be a lot of hatred. There's going to be a lot of everything. That's going to be a civil uprising. I feel like definitely because if history's ever showed us anything, when you oppress a group of population like that, it's going to turn into an uprising. It's going to be civil unrest for sure.
Especially when they've tasted the sweet nectar of freedom,
Just have it stripped away from you.
Yeah. The thing too is like, this goes back so far that like if the Chinese government thinks that, Hong Kong is part of China and thus, it's the right of the Communist Party to own it. Hong Kong existed before the Communist Party existed. The original civil war for China was between the what was it, the Federalists or the Loyalists versus the Communists? Nationalists. Yeah. That one. The Nationalists versus the Communists. They didn't even own China when Hong Kong was a country. So, if that argument is presented, I'd say it's invalid because Hong Kong precedes the communist China, and so it's not current communist China's right to them. The only thing that's the right to them is the written treaties. There's a lot to it. I think Hong Kong would do very well as its own independent nation, but that is a talk for another time. Coming up next, we go off the rails as we talk about random topics and just have fun. Those listening on YouTube, our discussion ends here, I'm afraid. But check out the link in the description and join our Discord for our full show and other great discussions on the forums. Thanks for listening, and thank you for having the discussion.